Before Greece gave us philosophy, before Rome gave us law, before the Renaissance gave us art. One civilization had already done all of it. Ancient Egypt did not just survive for 3,000 years. It invented the idea that a society could be more than a collection of people trying not to die, that it could be something organised, beautiful and permanent. This is the story of how a river, a flood and one extraordinary culture quietly wrote the first draft of human civilization. Consider the math of human civilization. The wheel was invented roughly 5,000 years ago. The first written legal code appeared around 4,000 years ago. The Roman Empire, which many consider the apex of the ancient world, rose only 2,000 years ago. Modern democratic governments are barely 2 to 3 centuries old. Now hold all of that against one single fact. Before any of those milestones, one civilization had already been running a centralized government, constructing skyscraper-sized monuments, performing documented surgical procedures, and recording its history in a sophisticated written language. For centuries, that civilization was ancient Egypt. While most early human societies lived in scattered tribes or small city-states, Egypt was already operating as a unified nation-state with a bureaucracy, a tax system, a standing army, and a philosophical tradition capable of asking questions about death, justice, and the cosmos. Inscriptions describe pharaohs managing grain supplies across hundreds of miles of territory at a time when most of the world had not yet invented the concept of surplus storage. And this is what makes Egypt genuinely strange in the story of human civilization. It did not merely exist alongside other ancient cultures. It preceded most of them, and then quietly handed its ideas forward, century by century, to the Greeks, the Romans, and eventually to the modern world. Records show that Greek philosophers travelled to Egypt to sit at the feet of its priests. Chronologies indicate that Roman emperors transported Egyptian obelisks to their capital as trophies of intellectual prestige, not just military conquest. Even the early Christian world borrowed the visual language of Egyptian religious art. But the deeper question, the one that actually matters, is not simply that Egypt influenced the ancient world. The deeper question is this: how did a civilization born in a narrow river valley, surrounded by desert on almost every side, become the blueprint that civilization itself would follow for the next 3,000 years? The answer does not begin with a pharaoh or a pyramid or a conquering army. It begins with a flood. Every year, with a reliability that no other river in the ancient world could match, the Nile overflowed its banks. And every year, when its waters receded, they left behind a layer of dark, mineral-rich silt across the floodplain. In a continent dominated by harsh, dry terrain, this annual deposit created a strip of extraordinarily fertile land, a natural agricultural engine that required almost no irrigation engineering to function. This was Egypt's founding advantage. Other early civilizations fought their environments constantly. Egypt's environment fed it on a schedule, and that stability freed Egyptian society to do something almost no other early culture could afford: think long term. Layers of archaeological evidence reveal that within just a few generations of settled farming along the Nile, Egyptian communities were already organising labour at a scale that dwarfs anything their contemporaries attempted. They were not just surviving, they were building, and what they built would outlast every empire that tried to replace them. Yes, around 3,100 years before the birth of Christ, something happened in northeastern Africa that had never happened anywhere on earth before. A ruler named Narmer looked at two separate kingdoms, Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt in the north, and decided they should be one. This sounds simple. It was not. Unifying two distinct regions, each with its own culture, its own local rulers, and its own deeply held identity, required more than military force. And it required the invention of an entirely new kind of political authority, one powerful enough to make people across hundreds of miles of territory feel bound to the same system, the same laws, and the same leader. Nama pulled it off, and in doing so he created one of the earliest centralised governments in recorded human history. What emerged was not a loose alliance of city-states agreeing to cooperate, the way many early Mediterranean societies were organised. It was a single, unified kingdom with a defined hierarchy, a capital city, a professional administrative class, and one man at the top. That man carried a title the world would come to know across 3,000 years of history: Pharaoh. But the pharaoh was not simply a king in the way later European monarchs would be kings, rulers who governed by inherited right and military power alone. The Egyptian pharaoh occupied a category of authority that had no real parallel anywhere else in the ancient world at that time. He was believed to be divine, not merely favoured by the gods or appointed by them, but actually divine, a living bridge between the human world and the cosmic order that governed it. This distinction mattered enormously, and not just for religious reasons. When a ruler is mortal, his subjects can, and eventually do, question his decisions, challenge his legitimacy, or simply wait for him to die. When a ruler is understood to be a god made flesh, disagreement with him becomes something closer to disagreement with the structure of the universe itself. Egyptian inscriptions describe the pharaoh as the guarantor of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, balance and rightness that held the world together. If the pharaoh ruled well, the Nile flooded on schedule, crops grew, and the stars stayed in their courses. The entire natural order was understood to flow through him. That belief system gave the Egyptian state a degree of internal stability that was almost unprecedented for its time. It also gave the pharaohs something extraordinarily practical: the ability to mobilize people, organizing a large population to do anything, build infrastructure, manage food distribution, defend borders, construct monuments, requires that the population trusts the authority giving the orders. In Egypt, that trust was built not just into law, but into religion. The result was a society capable of coordinating labour on a scale that simply had no comparison in the ancient world. Tens of thousands of workers could be fed, housed, directed and managed across enormous construction projects lasting decades. Agricultural output could be tracked, taxed, stored and redistributed across the entire country from a central administration. No other society of that era had demonstrated this was possible. Egypt did not just demonstrate it, Egypt perfected it. And here is where the story begins to reach beyond Egypt's own borders. The concept of divine kingship, the idea that a ruler derives his authority not from the consent of the governed, but from a direct connection to the divine, did not stay contained within the Nile Valley. Chronologies indicate that neighbouring civilizations observed what Egypt had built and absorbed its logic. Rulers across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and eventually the Mediterranean world adopted variations of the same framework. The king as cosmic intermediary, the state as sacred institution, centralized authority as the organizing principle of civilization. Centuries later, Roman emperors would claim divine status. Medieval European kings would insist on divine right. The language changed, the geography changed. Yet the underlying architecture of power, first assembled in Egypt around 3100 years before Christ, remained remarkably consistent. Egypt had not just built a kingdom, it had built the template that kingdoms would follow for the next 3 millennia. Power can build an empire. Only writing can make it last. Egypt understood this earlier than almost any other civilization on earth. While the pharaoh's authority organised the living, and it was the scribe's reed brush that ensured everything Egypt learned, built and believed would survive long after any individual ruler was gone. Somewhere around the same period that Egypt was consolidating its political structure, its administrators began developing one of the most sophisticated communication systems the ancient world had ever produced: hieroglyphs. The word itself comes from the Greek for sacred carvings, but that description barely scratches the surface of what the system actually was. Egyptian hieroglyphs were not a simple alphabet. They were a layered, complex writing system that combined phonetic sounds, symbolic images, and conceptual markers, capable of expressing everything from the mundane details of a grain shipment to the intricate theology of the afterlife. Learning to read and write them fluently took years of dedicated training. The scribes who mastered the system formed one of the most influential professional classes in Egyptian society. Not warriors, not priests, but writers. And what they wrote down changed everything. Before writing, knowledge lived inside people. It travelled by word of mouth, passed from elder to apprentice, from priest to initiate, from farmer to son. This system worked, but it was fragile. A plague, a famine, a war, or simply the death of the wrong person at the wrong time could erase generations of accumulated understanding in a single generation. Egypt broke that fragility. Scribes recorded the precise measurements of land boundaries after each annual flood, so that property disputes could be settled by documentation rather than by force. They catalogued tax obligations across every district in the kingdom, creating a financial nervous system that allowed the central government to function across vast distances. They preserved surgical procedures detailed enough that modern physicians have studied them with genuine admiration. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, for example, describes the diagnosis and treatment of nearly 50 medical conditions with a clinical precision that feels startlingly modern. They committed religious rituals to papyrus and temple walls so that the correct words, offerings, and ceremonies could be performed identically across every temple in the country, regardless of which priests happened to be on duty. Religious texts, administrative records, medical knowledge, agricultural calendars, historical chronicles, legal codes, Egypt archived all of it. The consequence was extraordinary. While neighbouring cultures were effectively starting from scratch, with each new generation relearning, rediscovering, renegotiating what they knew, Egypt was accumulating. Each generation of Egyptian scribes inherited not just their parents' knowledge, but their grandparents', their great-grandparents', and the knowledge of scribes who had lived centuries before them. The written archive turned Egyptian civilization into something almost biological in its capacity for memory. It could learn, store, and transmit information across time in a way that oral cultures simply could not replicate. By the time foreign visitors began arriving in significant numbers, this accumulated depth of recorded history had become one of Egypt's most astonishing features. When the Greek historian Herodotus travelled to Egypt in the 5th century before Christ, he encountered a civilization that could trace its documented history back further than anything he had ever seen. The priests he spoke with did not recount myths and legends from memory. They pointed to written records, and inscriptions described dynastic successions stretching back more than 2,000 years before his visit. Herodotus, who was already considered one of the most well-travelled and intellectually curious men of his age, described Egypt with barely concealed awe. He had come from a culture that considered itself sophisticated. Egypt made Greece look young. That reaction was not unique to Herodotus. Scholar after scholar, visitor after visitor, has arrived in Egypt and left with the same impression, that they were standing inside the longest continuous record of human civilization that the world had ever produced. Egypt had become, in a very literal sense, the historical memory of the ancient world. Other civilizations built monuments to show what they had achieved. Egypt built archives to prove it, and the proof survived long enough to reshape every culture that came to study it. At some point, their ambition stopped being abstract in Egypt and became stone. By the period historians call the Old Kingdom, roughly the 3rd millennium before Christ, the Egyptian state had assembled all of the ingredients that a civilization needs to attempt something genuinely impossible: a unified government capable of directing massive human effort, an agricultural surplus large enough to feed a non-farming workforce, a mathematical tradition precise enough to solve complex structural problems, and a written administrative system able to coordinate logistics across an entire country. What Egypt chose to do with all of that is still, by almost any measure, one of the most remarkable things any human society has ever attempted. It decided to build mountains. The pyramid building era did not begin with the Great Pyramid. It began with experimentation, with earlier rulers commissioning stepped structures that evolved, failed, were corrected, and then gradually refined over generations of trial and accumulated engineering knowledge. By the time the pharaoh Khufu commissioned his tomb, around 2,560 years before Christ, Egypt had already spent more than a century learning how to stack stone at scale. What Khufu ordered was not a first attempt. It was a culmination. The result was the Great Pyramid of Giza. The numbers attached to this structure have been repeated so often that they risk losing their power, and so consider them slowly. The pyramid contains an estimated 2.5 million stone blocks. The heaviest of these weigh more than 80 tons, roughly the weight of a fully loaded commercial truck, moved without wheels, cranes or engines. The base covers an area so large that several of the world's major cathedrals could fit inside its footprint simultaneously. The four sides align with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, a west, with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree. This was not approximate engineering. This was precision at a scale that challenges explanation. Modern researchers have spent decades debating exactly how it was done. The current leading evidence points to a combination of sledges, water-lubricated ramps, and highly organised labour teams rotating in and out on scheduled shifts. Workers who, records show, were not slaves but paid labourers, fed a documented daily ration of bread, beer, and meat, and given medical attention when injured on the job. The logistics of feeding, housing, and directing a workforce of tens of thousands over 2 decades of continuous construction required an administrative apparatus of extraordinary sophistication. Egypt did not just build a pyramid, it built an entire organisational system capable of producing one. And then, for roughly 4,000 years, the Great Pyramid stood as the tallest structure human hands had ever raised above the earth. And not for a decade, not for a century. For 4 millennia, no architect in any civilization, Greek, Roman, Persian, Byzantine, medieval European, managed to exceed it. That fact alone tells you something important about what Egypt had achieved. Word travelled. It always does. Merchants, diplomats, soldiers and scholars passing through the ancient Mediterranean carried descriptions of the Giza Plateau back to their home cultures, and those descriptions drew more visitors, who carried more descriptions further still. By the classical Greek period, the Great Pyramid had already been famous for so long that Herodotus, writing roughly 2,000 years after its construction, treated it as a well-established wonder rather than a discovery. Greek tourists visited it. Roman administrators made detours to see it. Travellers who had no other reason to enter Egypt came specifically to stand at its base and look up. What they took home with them was more than a memory. The ambition encoded in the pyramid, the idea that a civilization could organise itself to build something permanent, something that declared we were here in a language that required no translation, spread outward from Egypt like a slow tide. Monumental architecture began appearing across the ancient world. Grand temples, ceremonial columns, triumphal arches. The specific forms changed with each culture. The underlying impulse to make stone do what time cannot was Egyptian in its origin. And the pyramid was not just a tomb. It was a statement about what civilization was capable of. And the ancient world never forgot it. Every great civilization asked the same fundamental questions. What holds the universe together? What happens when we die? What do we owe the gods? And what do they owe us? What separated Egypt from most of its contemporaries was not that it asked these questions. It was the sophistication of the answers it constructed, and how far those answers eventually travelled. But Egyptian religion was not a simple system of gods and rituals. It was a comprehensive philosophical framework for understanding existence itself. At its foundation sat a concept that governed everything: Ma'at. Ma'at was not a deity in the conventional sense. It was a principle, the idea that the universe operated according to an underlying order, a cosmic balance between truth, justice and harmony that had existed since the moment of creation. The pharaoh's primary duty, above all political obligations, was to maintain Ma'at. Priests maintained it through ritual. Individuals maintained it through ethical behaviour. When Ma'at was upheld, the Nile flooded on schedule, crops flourished, and the stars moved correctly across the sky. When it was violated, chaos followed. This was a remarkably coherent worldview, one that linked individual morality to cosmic consequence in a way that gave Egyptian religion both personal and universal dimensions simultaneously. But within that framework lived a vast and intricate mythology. The god Osiris ruled the realm of the dead, having been murdered by his brother Set and then resurrected through the devotion of his wife Isis. Their son Horus, the falcon-headed deity of the sky, avenged his father and claimed the throne of the living world, becoming the divine model that every pharaoh was understood to embody during his reign. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris. His successor became Horus. The cycle repeated, a generation after generation, binding the living and the dead into a single continuous story. These were not casual folk tales. They were theological architecture, carefully constructed narratives that explained death, resurrection, justice, and the transfer of power within a single coherent mythology. And central to all of it was a belief that death was not an ending. The Egyptian afterlife was not a vague promise of peace. It was an elaborately mapped destination, governed by precise rules, accessible only to those who had prepared properly. The soul of the deceased underwent judgment in the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart was weighed against a feather, the feather of Ma'at, to determine whether the life lived had been just. Those who passed entered a paradise called the Field of Reeds, an idealized version of the Egyptian countryside, where existence continued in comfort and abundance. This belief had enormous practical consequences. If death was a transition rather than a termination, then preparing for it was not a morbid obsession, it was rational planning. The body needed to be preserved because the soul required a physical anchor to return to, hence mummification, a multi-stage preservation process so technically sophisticated that modern scientists have analysed mummies thousands of years old and found evidence of medicinal herbs, surgical interventions, and chemical compounds applied with clear intentionality. The tombs needed to be stocked with food, tools, furniture, and written guides, because the deceased would need them. Monuments needed to be built large enough and strong enough to last forever, because forever was genuinely the time frame being planned for. What began as a deeply Egyptian set of beliefs did not stay Egyptian. As trade routes expanded and Egypt's cultural reach grew across the Mediterranean, its religious ideas travelled with its merchants, diplomats, and conquered peoples. The goddess Isis proved particularly transportable. Her story, devoted wife, grieving mother, powerful protector, intermediary between the human and divine, resonated across cultural boundaries in a way that many other Egyptian deities did not. By the height of the Roman Empire, formal temples to Isis had been constructed in cities as far-flung as Rome itself, Pompeii, and across the provinces of Gaul and Britain. Roman citizens who had never set foot in Egypt lit incense before her image and prayed in rituals that descended in a direct and traceable line from ceremonies performed along the Nile more than 1,000 years earlier. Isis had crossed the Mediterranean. She had crossed languages, empires, and centuries, and she had done it carrying the philosophical DNA of a civilization that understood, earlier than almost anyone, that the most powerful ideas are not the ones that explain how to live, but the ones that explain what living is for. There is a version of history that places ancient Greece at the origin point of Western civilization, the moment when humanity first became truly rational, truly philosophical, truly scientific. It is a compelling story. It is also incomplete, because by the time Greek civilization began its celebrated flowering, Egypt had already been doing mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and monumental architecture for roughly 2,000 years. Greece did not emerge in isolation. It emerged in conversation, and one of its most important conversation partners was the civilization sitting at the southern edge of the Mediterranean, ancient beyond anything the Greeks had a framework to fully comprehend. The relationship was not one of equals exchanging ideas. It was closer to that of an eager student and a very old teacher. Greek scholars travelled to Egypt deliberately and in significant numbers. This was not casual tourism. These were men who had already distinguished themselves intellectually at home, who understood that Egypt possessed accumulated knowledge their own culture had not yet independently developed, and who made the journey specifically to access it. What they encountered reshaped Greek intellectual life in ways that rippled forward through centuries of Western thought. Well, the influence began with practical knowledge. Egyptian mathematics was not theoretical in the Greek sense. It was precise, applied, and extraordinarily refined by long use. Egyptian surveyors had been calculating land areas, volumes, and structural load-bearing requirements for thousands of years before Greek philosophers began formalizing geometry as a discipline. Scholars have long noted that several foundational principles attributed to early Greek mathematical tradition show clear evidence of Egyptian precedent. The tools were already there. Greece gave them new names and built new frameworks around them. Astronomy followed a similar pattern. The Egyptian calendar, built around careful observation of the Nile's flood cycles and the movement of specific stars, particularly Sirius, represented centuries of documented celestial observation. Greek astronomers arriving in Egypt found a culture that had been tracking the night sky with systematic precision since before most Greek city-states existed. The data Egypt had accumulated, inscribed in temple ceilings and administrative records, gave visiting scholars a foundation to build on rather than a blank page to start from. Architecture told the same story. The Greeks are rightly celebrated for the elegance and proportion of their temples and public buildings. But the ambition to construct monumental structures in stone, to use architecture as a statement of cultural power and permanence, was a lesson Egypt had already written in the most durable language available. Greek architects who visited the Nile Valley did not return home with Egyptian aesthetics intact. They returned with a deeper understanding of what stone could be made to do, and what buildings could be made to mean. The philosophical borrowing ran deeper still, and proved more controversial over time. Several ancient sources describe early Greek thinkers spending extended periods studying with Egyptian priests, men who were simultaneously religious authorities and the custodians of Egypt's deepest intellectual traditions. The priests did not teach casually. Access to the inner chambers of Egyptian religious philosophy required initiation, trust, and time. That scholars made the sustained effort required to earn that access says something about how seriously they regarded what Egypt had to offer. Herodotus, for his part, was direct about the debt. He described Egyptian civilization with a reverence he extended to very few cultures, and he was explicit that Greek religious traditions, including some of the most fundamental concepts around the nature of the gods and the structure of the cosmos, had Egyptian roots. As this matters because of what Greece became. Greek philosophy, science, and political thought went on to form the intellectual backbone of the Roman world, then of the European medieval tradition, then of the Enlightenment, and ultimately of the modern Western worldview. Ideas that billions of people today consider foundational to civilization, democracy, logic, geometry, the scientific method, pass through Greece on their way to the present. But a significant portion of what Greece absorbed and then transmitted had first been worked out along the Nile. The origin story of Western civilization does not begin in Athens. It begins considerably further south, and considerably further back in time. In 332 years before Christ, the most powerful military force the ancient world had ever seen arrived at Egypt's borders. Alexander the Great had already carved a path of conquest from Macedonia through Persia and into the eastern Mediterranean. Cities that resisted him were destroyed. Rulers who defied him were deposed. Entire political orders that had stood for centuries were dismantled in the span of a campaign season. By the time Alexander reached Egypt, the pattern was well established. What he conquered, he remade in his own image. Egypt proved to be the exception. Rather than imposing Greek culture over Egyptian tradition and demanding submission, Alexander did something that surprised almost everyone who observed it. He participated. He travelled to the ancient oracle at Siwa, deep in the western desert, and consulted its priests in the Egyptian manner. He made offerings to Egyptian gods. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate pharaoh, the next link in a chain of divine kingship that stretched back to Nama himself at more than 2,700 years earlier. Whether this was genuine reverence or calculated political strategy, the effect was the same. Egypt did not resist. Its priests accepted Alexander's legitimacy. Its people did not rise against him. A conquest that could have produced years of brutal suppression instead produced something far more interesting. A partnership between two of the ancient world's most intellectually formidable cultures. Alexander left Egypt relatively quickly, pulled eastward by the momentum of his larger campaign. But before he departed, he made one decision that would shape the course of civilization more profoundly than almost any battle he ever won. He founded a city on Egypt's Mediterranean coast and gave it his name, Alexandria. The location was chosen with characteristic strategic intelligence, a natural harbour facing the Mediterranean, positioned to become the commercial and cultural crossroads between Africa, Europe and the East. What no one could have fully anticipated was how completely Alexandria would fulfill that potential, and how quickly. After Alexander's death, Egypt passed to one of his generals, Ptolemy, who established a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greek in origin, but Egyptian in ambition. They understood that the civilization they now governed was older, deeper, and in many respects more sophisticated than the one they had come from. Rather than dismantling it, they invested in it, and in doing so transformed Alexandria into something the ancient world had never seen before. At the heart of the city rose an institution that still carries weight in the historical imagination, the Library of Alexandria. The library was not simply a large collection of books. It was a state-funded research institution, the ancient world's closest equivalent to a modern university, deliberately designed to gather every significant text in existence under one roof. Royal agents were dispatched across the known world with a mandate to acquire, copy, or confiscate manuscripts from every culture they encountered. Ships docking in Alexandria's harbour were required to surrender any scrolls they carried for copying before receiving them back. The library's collection grew to encompass hundreds of thousands of texts, covering mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, drama, history, and engineering from Egypt, Greece, Persia, Babylon, India, and beyond. Yet what happened inside those walls was something genuinely unprecedented. Scholars from different intellectual traditions, Egyptian priests working alongside Greek philosophers, Babylonian astronomers comparing notes with Egyptian mathematicians, found themselves in the same building, reading each other's texts, arguing across cultural boundaries, and producing ideas that neither tradition could have generated alone. Egyptian medical knowledge merged with Greek analytical philosophy to produce new frameworks for understanding the human body. Egyptian astronomical records, accumulated over centuries, gave Greek and Babylonian scholars a data set vast enough to reveal patterns in celestial movement that shorter observational traditions had missed. Greek methods of logical argumentation were applied to Egyptian theological traditions, producing philosophical syntheses that would eventually influence early Christian theology, Islamic scholarship, and Renaissance humanism. Alexandria became, in the most literal sense, the place where civilization learned from itself. The conquest that might have ended Egypt's intellectual legacy instead amplified it, broadcasting Egyptian knowledge outward through a Greek-speaking Mediterranean world that stretched from Spain to the borders of India. What Alexander took by force had he accidentally preserved for eternity, and the ideas that survived inside those walls in Alexandria would not stay there for long. Rome did not conquer Egypt the way Alexander had, with speed, admiration, and a degree of philosophical curiosity. Rome conquered Egypt the way Rome conquered most things, methodically, politically, and with an eye fixed firmly on resources. In 30 BC, following the deaths of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt was formally absorbed into the Roman Empire under Augustus Caesar. The 3,000-year experiment in pharaonic civilization was over as a political entity. Egypt was now a province, its grain harvests redirected to feed Rome's expanding population, its administration restructured under Roman governors answerable to a distant emperor. By every conventional measure of conquest, this should have been the moment Egypt's cultural influence began to fade. Instead, something almost paradoxical happened. The conquerors became the absorbed. Rome was, by the 1st century BC, the most powerful political entity the Western world had ever produced. Its legions were unmatched. Its legal system was sophisticated. Its engineering, roads, aqueducts, amphitheatres, was formidable. And yet, when Roman generals, emperors, and aristocrats encountered Egypt firsthand, the reaction was remarkably consistent across generations. Or, Julius Caesar had visited Egypt decades before the formal conquest, and returned to Rome visibly affected by what he had seen. Mark Antony went further. He effectively went native, aligning himself so completely with Egyptian culture and with Cleopatra that his Roman contemporaries accused him of abandoning his identity entirely. Augustus, who defeated Antony and claimed Egypt as his prize, was careful to present himself in Egypt as a pharaoh rather than a Roman governor, commissioning portraits in the Egyptian style, performing Egyptian religious rites, and maintaining the ancient temples rather than repurposing them. This pattern, Roman power adopting Egyptian cultural authority, repeated itself across the imperial period with remarkable consistency. The most visible expression of it was stone, Egyptian obelisks, towering monolithic columns of granite, carved with hieroglyphs and raised as monuments to pharaonic power, began appearing in Rome with a frequency that tells its own story. Augustus transported 2 obelisks to Rome, repurposing one as the central marker of a colossal sundial in the Campus Martius. Later emperors followed his example. By the height of the imperial period, Rome contained more Egyptian obelisks than Egypt itself. 13 ancient obelisks still stand in Rome today, more than in any other city on earth, and including Cairo. Consider what this means. Rome was the capital of the greatest empire in the Western world. Its emperors could commission any monument they wished, in any style, from any material available across a territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, and repeatedly across multiple centuries and multiple dynasties, they chose to import Egyptian stone and plant it at the symbolic heart of their city. They were not decorating. They were borrowing prestige, reaching back toward a civilization so ancient and so venerated that association with it conferred a kind of authority that Roman achievement alone could not manufacture. The religious borrowing ran equally deep. The cult of Isis, which had already spread across the Mediterranean during the Ptolemaic period, continued expanding under Roman rule with imperial blessing. Temples to Isis operated openly in Rome despite occasional periods of official ambivalence. Her worship attracted followers across every social class, from slaves to senators. And her iconography, a mother goddess holding or nursing a divine child, proves so enduringly resonant that art historians have traced its visual influence forward into early Christian depictions of the Virgin Mary. Egyptian aesthetics shaped Roman architecture in subtler but traceable ways as well. The use of massive stone columns to create processional approaches to sacred spaces. The integration of astronomical alignment into monumental buildings, the concept of the temple complex as a self-contained sacred landscape. All of these architectural ideas had been worked out in Egypt long before Roman builders applied their own engineering precision to similar problems. What Rome ultimately demonstrated, without quite intending to, was a truth that Egypt's entire history had been quietly building toward. Political power has a lifespan, armies age, empires overextend, dynasties end. Every political structure that history has ever produced has eventually collapsed, been replaced, or simply dissolved under the weight of time. But ideas move differently. They do not require armies to travel, or administrators to maintain them, or tax revenues to survive. They require only that someone find them useful, or beautiful, or true, and carry them forward. Egypt had lost its independence. It had lost its pharaohs, its administrative language, and its political sovereignty. What it had not lost, what it proved impossible to conquer, was the accumulated weight of everything it had thought, built, recorded, and believed across 3,000 years of unbroken civilization. Rome had taken Egypt's grain. Egypt had taken Rome's imagination. For nearly 1,400 years, Egypt was a civilization that the world could see but could no longer hear. The monuments were still there. The pyramids still rose above the Giza plateau, visible from miles away, undeniable in their scale. The temples still stood at Karnak and Luxor, their walls covered in carved images and columns of symbols that stretched from floor to ceiling. The papyrus scrolls still existed in fragments and collections scattered across the Mediterranean world. But the language encoded in all of it, the hieroglyphs that had once allowed Egyptian scribes to record everything from surgical procedures to royal decrees, had become completely unreadable. The last known inscription, written in hieroglyphs, dates to 394 years after the birth of Christ. Within a generation or two of that final carving, the trained scribal class that had maintained the reading tradition for more than 3,000 years had effectively disappeared, absorbed into a Christianized Greek-speaking world that had little use for the old sacred writing, and with them went the key. What remained was a civilization frozen in mid-sentence. Travellers, scholars and conquerors passed through Egypt across the medieval and early modern periods and stared at the inscriptions covering every major monument. They knew they were looking at language. They could see the careful deliberateness of it, the repeated symbols, the organised columns, the obvious intentionality. But the meaning was gone. Theories multiplied in the absence of understanding. Some medieval scholars concluded that hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, each image representing a philosophical concept rather than a sound or word. Others believed they concealed mystical secrets, deliberately obscured to protect sacred knowledge from the uninitiated. For over a millennium, one of the most extensively documented civilizations in human history was effectively mute. Then, in the summer of 1799, a French soldier digging fortification trenches near the town of Rosetta in northern Egypt struck something unexpected. A large and dark slab of granodiorite stone, roughly the size of a small tabletop, covered in 3 distinct bands of text. The soldier recognized immediately that the stone was significant. It was passed up the chain of command, eventually reaching French scholars accompanying Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, a military expedition that had brought, somewhat unusually, a contingent of scientists, historians, and linguists alongside its soldiers. What those scholars recognized, examining the stone carefully, was extraordinary. The same text had been inscribed on the stone in 3 different scripts: ancient Greek, which European scholars could read fluently, Demotic, a later Egyptian administrative script, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was a decree, issued by a council of priests in 196 years before Christ, during the reign of the Ptolemaic pharaoh Ptolemy V, and it had been recorded in all 3 scripts to ensure it could be read by every literate person in Egypt at the time. The stone was, in essence, a translation key that had been waiting in the ground for nearly 2,000 years. Even with the Rosetta Stone in hand, decipherment took more than 2 decades. The puzzle was genuinely difficult. Hieroglyphs were not a simple substitution code, and early attempts by brilliant scholars produced only partial results. It was the French linguist Jean-François Champollion who finally broke through completely in 1822 by combining his extraordinary command of Coptic, the latest form of the Egyptian language still used in Christian liturgy, with painstaking analysis of the stone's parallel text to establish, symbol by symbol, how the hieroglyphic system actually functioned. When the last piece fell into place, the effect on historical understanding was immediate and profound. Suddenly, the frozen civilization thawed. Texts that had been decorative mysteries for over a millennium became readable documents. Scholars began working through the accumulated written record of ancient Egypt, the medical papyri, the legal codes, the administrative archives, the religious texts, the royal annals, and what they found rewrote the timeline of human achievement in ways that continue to reverberate through historical scholarship today. The medical knowledge encoded in Egyptian papyri proved more systematic and evidence-based than anyone had assumed. The legal and administrative records revealed a governmental apparatus of genuine sophistication: taxation systems, property law, labour regulation, judicial processes, operating at a scale and complexity that no other civilization of comparable antiquity had documented so thoroughly. The religious and philosophical texts demonstrated a tradition of ethical and cosmological thinking that predated Greek philosophy by centuries and showed clear points of influence running forward into traditions that shaped the modern world. And then there was the simple, staggering matter of chronology. As scholars read through the royal annals and dynastic records, the full length of Egyptian civilization became undeniable in a way that no monument alone could convey. This was not a culture that had risen quickly, achieved something impressive, and collapsed. This was a civilization that had maintained continuous, documented, sophisticated existence for more than 3,000 years, longer than the gap between the fall of Rome and the present day. The Rosetta Stone had not just unlocked a language, it had revealed the true depth of what humanity had already been capable of, and had largely forgotten. Here, then, is the realization that the entire story has been building toward. Long before Greece formalized philosophy, Egypt had been asking the same questions for centuries. Long before Rome built its empire, Egypt had already demonstrated how centralized authority, monumental architecture, written law, and organized religion could hold a vast civilization together across millennia. Long before the modern world developed its most foundational institutions, Egypt had already built earlier versions of them, and left detailed written records explaining how they worked. The pyramids still stand along the Nile today. Tourists photograph them. Engineers study them. Children learn about them in schools on every continent. But they are not the most important thing Egypt left behind. The most important thing Egypt left behind was the proof, carved in stone, written on papyrus, encoded in the foundations of every civilization that came after, that the long, difficult, extraordinary project of human civilization did not begin where most people think it did. It began where it always begins, beside a river with a flood, and people determined to build something that would last.